Welcome to Eorzea. Following the release of Shadowbringers, the world of Final Fantasy XIV has exploded in popularity, spurred by critical acclaim, word-of-mouth promotion, and a global crisis that forced many people to stay indoors. The game's growth led to a new influx of Twitch streamers and even resulted in the game's director, Naoki Yoshida, apologizing over server capacity issues as players waited in queues just to enter the game. All of this happened as the largest MMO on the market, World of Warcraft, released a new expansion to poor reviews and news of a lawsuit filed by the state of California. Even before the allegations were released against Activision Blizzard, some MMO fans waged a battle between the two games, presented as a kind of social media war between a titan of the industry and the smaller, steady rise of an upstart MMO. For years, Final Fantasy XIV has been given the role of an underdog. Its fanbase has been vocal, even defensive of the game's appeal, praising its story and raids, the developers' commitment to their community, and the many quality of life systems that separate it from competitors who seem to want players logged in for as long as possible. It's almost as if fans want to, in their own way, validate their time in the game and why they love it so much. From an outsider's perspective, it's easy to see why this supposed competition between games sounds almost like a David and Goliath situation. However, for longtime gamers, the meteoric rise of Final Fantasy XIV should not come as much of a surprise. If anything, it is simply a return to form, the reintroduction of a heavyweight for younger audiences. And it all begins with the first two words of the title. Since the earliest days of the console wars, games within genres have been highly competitive by their nature, and 14 is no exception. For much of its lifespan, it has largely been regarded as that other MMO, with little regard to anything else about the series. Players critiquing the game may focus on the early leveling experience, the UI, and early combat. Certainly, as an MMO, all of these things are important to understanding the genre, especially if coming from other games. However, these conversations do not quite cover the full scope of why so many players are moving to its world of Eorzea. Instead, to understand the success of Final Fantasy XIV, players must go back to 1987 and the original Nintendo Entertainment System. When the first Final Fantasy was released, no one really knew how big the series would become. The common myth is that the name came as producer Hironobu Sakaguchi wanted one last hurrah before giving up games entirely to return to university. In truth, it had more to do with marketing and a trademark conflict with a novel, but from its humble beginnings, the Final Fantasy franchise has been steeped in a rich mythos of its own. In the modern gaming ecosphere full of open worlds, action-adventure, shooters, and every other type of genre under the sun, the idea of a simple, turn-based RPG is almost quaint. Even by the standards of its own franchise, the first Final Fantasy game is fairly barren. There's not much of a story, and most of a player's time will be spent grinding random mobs just to afford a single sword. Yet somehow, it just felt right. A natural evolution of role-playing games from the earliest days of Dungeons & Dragons or text-based MUDs. Its unique battle system emphasized strategy over spamming buttons, and the job system gave the world a feel of a true adventure among friends. Tying it all together was a soundtrack made on a casual offer to composer Nobuo Uematsu, who wrote the iconic prelude in less than 10 minutes. The game's impact was immediate and profound. Final Fantasy was not just a success, it became the golden standard for the genre of Japanese RPGs, and vaulted Squaresoft into the status of one of the world's premier publishers. Games tend to be cyclical, with genres coming and going in popularity every few years or so. For younger gamers used to League of Legends or Apex, it's entirely possible to have had almost no exposure to traditional JRPGs, outside of franchises like Pokemon, of course. It's an understandable situation. JRPGs, with their sweeping stories and 40-plus hour runtimes, require attention that seems to be ever increasingly in short supply for a chaotic economy. But in the 90s? Well, that was when JRPGs sat on the throne.
Okay, kid, show me what you got.
It's hard to overstate just how large the influence of Final Fantasy has been to the gaming industry, or how quickly the franchise developed into a powerhouse. As new games came out, they evolved into something familiar and exciting for players with a few key features that separated them from others. Each title was different, with sweeping narratives that took dozens of hours to complete, and lovingly crafted characters who have been rocketed into gaming stardom. They pushed the limits of the console hardware of the time, both in graphics and in Uematsu's instantly recognizable scores. Yet there were also familiar through lines through each game. Chocobos and Moogles, Cids and Espers, all of which became hallmarks that let you know you were truly in a Final Fantasy game. As a comparison to the current discussion about 14, when the first Warcraft game was released in 1994, Square had just released Final Fantasy VI, and a few months later would release Chrono Trigger, two titles routinely seen on all-time best lists. This is not to downplay Warcraft, of course, but simply to show the Final Fantasy titles have been a very big deal for a very long time. Squaresoft titles became not just hype releases, but all-consuming events. Even the release of just a few new screenshots of an upcoming Final Fantasy title made for cover articles across the trade magazines at the time. As the series moved into the PlayStation era with the explosive release of Final Fantasy VII, it was clear that the Final Fantasy name stood next to the Marios and the Zeldas of the world as something that had transcended gaming and become a part of pop culture. Of course, any name that large can have its growing pains. This series has seen its share of missteps, and it is in that reality that Final Fantasy XIV has had to earn its name. After a disastrous film release in 2001, the company struggled to regain the same air of prestige the franchise once held. While Final Fantasy XI did well as Japan's first major MMO, it never reached the heights of its competition and largely remains forgotten in the FF canon. On the other hand, 13 was received poorly by fans, and while the most recent title in 15 garnered mostly positive reviews, many fans complained that the story was confusing, lacked notable women, and relied too heavily on side material like its film and novel. Between a mountain of spin-off titles and the gradual course of time, Final Fantasy as a franchise seemed to fade into the background of gaming culture after nearly 3 decades of dominance. Which of course brings us to today. The problems with 14's launch are well documented and certainly contributed to its status as an underdog in the MMO market. Yet it is through the legacy of the name that it has managed to emerge slowly and steadily into what it is today. It is because of the power of the name that a few key people within Square Enix decided that 14 was worth the gamble to remake. The long march towards the release of Shadowbringers might act as a reminder that the franchise has always been there, a welcome name that fans are eager to find reasons to love. Before names like Blizzard and Amazon existed, there was Final Fantasy, telling its stories for anyone willing to listen. That's not to say that 14 doesn't have its faults or is immune to criticism, of course. As an MMO with its own genre conventions, comparisons between games should be heard and considered. The game does start slow. Other Final Fantasies, for example, start right in the middle of the action, while 14 doesn't. And while grinding for hours to level up is as much a staple of the franchise as Shiva, the nature of MMO combat gives this grind a very different feel than its predecessors. And just as the other numbered titles are judged on their own merits, so too must 14. This is where the debate in assessing 14 probably comes in. It is designed ultimately as a numbered Final Fantasy title, up to and including the story being the main draw. Yet while players know what they are getting into with a JRPG, MMOs by their nature will draw comparisons. This has led to countless discussions, sometimes even nasty ones, that put Final Fantasy XIV and its competitors into a needless argument over their qualities. Even Yoshi P addressed this conflict, stating via translation that there would be no Final Fantasy XIV without World of Warcraft. Rather than seeing this as a competition created by fans of their respective games, it might be good to reframe the conversation as less of a battle between giants and more of a celebration of an historic series. No one is doing better off for a game doing badly, but fans absolutely win when games are doing well. While everyone is different, many players are not necessarily happy that 14 is beating World of Warcraft, but instead are excited that they are in a Final Fantasy game. With over 160 million copies sold, Final Fantasy is one of gaming's biggest selling franchises of all time. For much of the gaming world, questions are often less about which number is best, but rather which one is their favorite. So 14 is less of a victory and more of a love letter, the only numbered title that is a persistent, evolving renewal of a beloved franchise. For some players, the world of Eorzea may be their first time experiencing a true Final Fantasy game. For others, it's nostalgia for what they grew up on. Either way, the game's success has allowed the Final Fantasy brand to come back into the limelight. It is not doing this alone. Between the pixel remasters of earlier titles, the remake of 7, and the release of 16 looming on the distant horizon, perhaps 14 is simply doing its part to remind the gaming world that the series still has power after 30 years. MMO or not, it just wants to stand worthy of the name Final Fantasy.